By the time Papyrus stumbled through the front door, there was no point in even going upstairs. He'd be getting up soon on a normal day. After checking for signs that Sans was awake, he wasn't, Papyrus started a pot of coffee. He'd need it today. He didn't need very much sleep, what most people would consider a long nap really, but staying up on top of hours of magical exertion had him feeling like the Walking Dead. At least he wasn't in pain anymore. His jaw only ached a little. Nothing compared to what was now technically yesterday. Flowey had kept his word. He sat at his usual place at the table while he waited on the coffee. The couch was out of the question. Lumpy as it was, he might fall asleep if he sat there. He stared at Sans' pet rock, counting the coloured sprinkles scattered over it. His head was empty, too tired and strung out for coherent thought. The coffee maker gurgled in the kitchen. 5 minutes, give or take, and then he could head upstairs and try to make a start on the reports.
Bro? Papyrus?
Papyrus sat up, blinking. What? When had he fallen asleep? He didn't even remember putting his head down. Sans looked him up and down, concern written in the set of his mouth.
What's up, bro?
Nothing, Papyrus said, still muzzy from an unknown but inadequate amount of sleep. Just drifted off, I guess.
Huh. Hey,
Sans said.
Your face looks better.
Papyrus's hand came up to his jaw on a strange impulse to hide it from view. I said I'd heal it once I was rested.
That was a lot to heal. You sure you didn't overdo it a little?
I'd rather be tired than sore. Wouldn't you? If Papyrus had actually tried to heal his own injuries, it would have taken a couple of hours, if not longer, and left him completely drained. After his training session, he probably looked fairly convincing. Sans' brow ticked upward a fraction of an inch as his gaze dropped to the floor at Papyrus's feet.
You know, you're always nagging me about tracking snow onto the carpet.
Papyrus followed his gaze to the damp patch around his boots, and the smaller patches leading from the table to the kitchen to the door. Sorry, he said. Forgot I still had my boots on. Usually he'd stamp the snow off on the welcome mat, but he hadn't wanted to make any noise.
Where'd you go?
Sans asked, idle curiosity injected into his voice and posture. Wasn't sleeping well, Papyrus said. Went for a walk. He reached out to sweep some of the rock sprinkles into his hand. It gave him an excuse to get up and move around. He wandered to the kitchen and dropped the stale sprinkles in the trash can. Sans scuffed along after him.
In yesterday's clothes?
While he was up and nearby, Papyrus supposed he might as well have that coffee. You do it all the time, he said, as he fished his favourite mug out of the drying rack. You're doing it right now.
That's because I'm an unrepentant slob,
Sans said, huffing.
And I think we discussed how I feel about you biting my style.
He watched Papyrus fix his coffee, frowning.
I can't believe you slept in your clothes again. Or did you even go to bed?
What does it matter? A sharp crack of bone on tile rang through the air as Sans brought his hand down on the countertop.
Because you need rest.
Papyrus jumped, coffee sloshing over the rim of the mug onto his hands. It wasn't hot enough anymore to burn, but his gloves were soaked through. He sighed. Sans cleared his throat and, at a lower volume, said,
Are you okay? I didn't mean to,
Papyrus nodded. It's not hot. Even if it had been, Bone was harder to scald than skin. It wouldn't have felt good, but it wouldn't have done any lasting harm. Setting the mug back down on the counter, he peeled his wet gloves off. He'd have to wash them before they stained. Sans leaned back against the counter, massaging his hand.
You were out in the woods again, weren't you?
It was more of a statement than a question.
Did you stay out all night? But, hey, I guess you passed out at the table for God knows how long, he said, shrugging. So you're all good now, right?
Don't use that voice at me, Papyrus said, irritation flaring up in his chest. He just wanted to drink his lukewarm coffee and get to work. Was he this annoying when he nagged Sans? Sans blinked.
What voice?
That voice you get. Like you think I'm still a kid or stupid or something. Sans used that voice on a lot of people. Not that they ever seemed to notice. Maybe Sans didn't notice either.
I don't think you're stupid,
Sans said meekly.
I'm just...
He trailed off with a helpless gesture. Silent kitchen hangout time was becoming a family tradition in record time.
Anyway,
Sans said, visibly pulling himself together.
We're missing a few things for this recipe I want to try. So, I thought I'd go, do that. Anything you need while I'm out?
Papyrus sipped what was left of his coffee. Nothing that isn't already on the list, he said, out of habit. His gaze caught the bare fridge door. He said, pinching the bridge of his nasal bone. I forgot to make a list. Grocery shopping hadn't been a high priority lately. He usually kept a running list of things they needed or were running low on, in hope that Sans would take it upon himself to pick up a few items now and then. Usually he didn't, but sometimes he did. Sometimes he even got everything on the list. For reasons Papyrus hadn't grasped until very recently, having a list to go off of seemed to make the chore easier for his brother. Right now, the thought of even looking through the kitchen to write a list out was too much. His exhaustion must have showed. If he looked half as bad as he felt, it was probably pretty obvious. Sans shrugged.
Don't sweat it, bro. I can handle it. It's just groceries.
Are you sure? Papyrus supposed they could always go together, but on the other hand, having an hour or so alone was looking very attractive. He needed some time to gather himself, maybe bathe, or at least change his clothes.
I'll be fine,
Sans said, waving him off.
It's probably my turn anyway. You just take it easy.
God, he must look terrible. While Sans was at the store, Papyrus showered and changed, and got started sorting through the heap of paper Undyne had left with him. He was glad to have something to do, even if he felt a little like he'd been put under house arrest. And even if what he'd been given to do was the definition of tedium. When he heard the door open, Papyrus took a break to help Sans put away the groceries. With the way his morning had been going, staring at sloppy handwriting was almost a relief, except that he already had a headache. Surprisingly, Sans had done a decent job, though he'd gotten a good deal of random items that didn't seem like they could go together. As Papyrus sorted out things that needed to go in the cupboard from things that needed to somehow fit in the fridge, he spied a distinctive brown paper bag in amongst the rest. Papyrus picked it up, pulling it free of the bag. It was heavier than he'd expected, more of a jug than a bottle. He glared at it skeptically. I seriously doubt your recipe calls for cider, let alone this much. Sans looked over from the cupboard he was filling with several varieties of pickles.
Hey, at that price I couldn't afford not to get it.
He winced and put his hands up in surrender.
Hey, don't look at me like that. It's not like I'm gonna drink it all today.
I should certainly hope not. Papyrus wasn't sure if it was even physically possible to drink that much at once, at least not without getting significant consequences. Neither of them had a liver to ruin, but even so. Once the groceries were squared away, Papyrus got back to work. With Sans volunteering to read the reports out loud and Papyrus transcribing, everything went much faster. By the time they stopped to fix lunch, they'd gotten through 9 reports. There were somewhere around 200 in all, by Papyrus's estimate, but it was a decent start. The recipe Sans wanted to try was, as Papyrus should have expected, quiche Lorraine. And quiche, as it turned out, was a pretty involved process if a monster were trying to do it right, which they assuredly were not going to do. Snowdon wasn't a big town, and the store only carried a small selection, plus whatever the shopkeeper found on excursions to the dump. This meant they had to make a few substitutions to the recipe. Yogurt for heavy cream, tinned red herring for slab bacon. Slight adjustments. It would probably work out.
Okay,
Sans said, gamely spooning yogurt into a large bowl.
She said we're supposed to separate the eggs.
Papyrus picked up the required number of eggs out of their carton, lining them up on the counter. Separate them from what? The lights in Sans's eye sockets went unfocused, face taking on a vacant expression.
You know, he said, I have no idea. Probably should have asked.
He picked up an egg, turning it over and over in his hands.
Separate them from the shells, maybe?
Papyrus didn't know what else he could possibly separate them from, though why Sans' mysterious recipe benefactor couldn't have told him to crack the eggs in plain language was beyond him. Unless it was meant to be a sort of puzzle. He wasn't sure either of them were up for subtle trickery when they were just trying to make lunch. He cracked the eggs into the bowl and mixed them with the yogurt. Sans added the salt and pepper, along with nutmeg? Well, Sans insisted that this woman was a good cook, although he'd never actually eaten anything of hers. As a beginner himself, Papyrus wasn't in a position to question the seasonings, even though his instincts were telling him garlic and oregano were the logical choice. "Who's Lorraine?" he asked as he stirred. The mixture wasn't looking very appetizing so far. Sort of unpleasantly slimy. "Is that her name?" It took a moment to wonder if he was having fun and just hadn't realized it. Sans was cooking with him. This should be a red letter day. And still, he couldn't recapture that feeling. He was almost happy, but it was washed out and grey. Maybe he was trying too hard. He put the thought from his mind and just stirred, watching the yolks mix in and disappear into the off-white of the yogurt. Sans blinked.
I don't think so. She doesn't strike me as the kind of person who names a recipe after herself. Somebody else must have, I guess.
A pungent, fishy smell soon permeated the kitchen. "How long have you been talking to this person?"
I don't know. A few months.
Odd to think it had been that long. Sans spoke of this person with more warmth than most of his other acquaintances put together, but Papyrus knew hardly anything about her, other than she had a distinctive sense of humour and liked to cook. "You've never asked her name?" Sans layered herrings in the bottom of the pre-made pie crust. Evidently, the woman had given him instructions on how to make the crust, but Papyrus found himself agreeing with Sans' own assessment that he was not the kind of person who made a crust from scratch. one step at a time.
I mean,
Sans said, after a thoughtful moment.
I think she would have offered a name by now if she wanted me to know it. And after this long, it'd be kinda awkward to ask.
He wiped his fingers on his jacket.
It doesn't really matter to me.
Sans didn't elaborate any further, and Papyrus didn't press. He had to admit, he was curious about anyone who could get Sans to do something like this, just by making him want to try. The best Papyrus had ever managed was nagging and arm-twisting Sans into some semblance of action. Or, lately, worrying him half sick. Once the makeshift custard mixture was poured over the herring, all that was left was to let the quiche bake. They did a few more reports while they waited. Papyrus studied the wedge of what was very nearly quiche Lorraine on his plate with no small measure of trepidation. It looked more or less the way he expected a quiche to look. The smell, though, the smell was interesting.
Well,
Sans said, poking at his own plate.
I guess it looks alright.
Mostly, it did. The custard was holding together, and the herring made a nice stripe along the bottom, save for a few delicate little fish ribs poking out the sides. Papyrus tried to think of it as added calcium. There was no turning back now. He had to at least try it. In one quick motion, he popped a bite into his mouth. The next few seconds were spent trying hard not to spit it back out. Sans watched him chew.
How is it?
He hadn't taken a bite himself yet. The quiche tasted about how it smelled, except more so. Papyrus gulped, trying and failing to suppress the weak cough that followed. He tried to find the words. It's not so bad, he said. Tears pricked at the corners of his eye sockets, but he persevered. He couldn't hurt his brother's feelings when he'd gone to all this effort. Sans brightened up at that.
Really? Because it smells like actual garbage.
Papyrus nodded, with what he hoped was an encouraging smile. It's a little salty, but it could have turned out worse, I think. That was the honest truth. Heartened by this, Sans took a bite. Slowly, the lights of his eyes crossed.
Oh my god,
he said. Don't talk with your mouth full, Papyrus said, trying to screw up the courage to take a second bite.
Am I dying?
Sans swallowed, with a half-second pause that made Papyrus worried that he'd somehow managed to choke without a windpipe.
Oh my god, that was unspeakable,
he said, pressing a hand to his chest as if to steady himself.
You lied.
Papyrus stared down at his next bite. At this point, it was him or the quiche. He couldn't back down from this challenge. I said it could have been worse, he said. At least it wasn't very sweet. It was still slightly sweet, though, which was odd and didn't seem right. There were a lot of things not right with this quiche. Sans hummed doubtfully while Papyrus crunched up another mouthful of baked fish and the attendant bones.
In retrospect,
Sans said,
vanilla yogurt was probably a mistake. Should have stuck with plain.
Papyrus nodded and swallowed. That would explain the weird, desserty flavor he hadn't been able to identify. There is room for improvement, he said.
You don't have to keep eating it,
Sans said, watching him take another bite.
It's god-awful.
Somehow the taste got worse the more he ate, but Papyrus refused to admit defeat to a pastry, no matter how foul. I said it wasn't that bad. Sans had made a meal with him. A new recipe, no less. So what if it tasted like despair and bad choices? Papyrus would eat the entire damned thing if he had to. The going got easier the closer he got to the crust. He found he was getting used to the taste. Not that he was ever going to like it, but familiar terrible was more manageable than new terrible. Once his sense of smell gave out, he was nigh unstoppable.
Whoa,
Sans gaped as Papyrus polished off the last few crumbs on his plate.
that was amazing.
A tiny spark of accomplishment ignited in Papyrus's chest. He slammed his fork down on the table. Cut me another piece. Sans met his gaze across the table and grinned.
Don't be a fool,
He said with a dramatic flourish.
No one could survive a second piece.
The great Papyrus will not lose. Lorraine! Papyrus pointed an accusing finger at the quiche lurking in the middle of the table. Your reign of terror ends here! With great solemnity, Sans walked to the kitchen, returning with the bottle of cider and 2 glasses.
I can't let you do this alone, bro,
He said.
I unleashed this abomination. I gotta take responsibility.
Papyrus didn't argue as Sans cut another generous wedge of quiche and placed it on his plate. If it made his brother happy, he didn't care. Even if he spent the rest of the day sick, it would be worth it. But he really was going to need a drink if he was going to make it through another ordeal like he just weathered. Sans alternated bites of quiche with swigs of cider, making a different amusing face each time.
Ugh,
He said, after a few gulps.
Where did this stuff come from? Someone's bathtub?
It's possible, Papyrus said. I suppose you get what you pay for. It was fairly nasty, he had to admit. He wasn't even sure if it was actually cider. If someone told him he was drinking paint thinner, he'd have believed them. It did a good job of burning away the taste of the quiche, though. In the end, Papyrus wasn't sure exactly how much quiche they'd each eaten, but after close to an hour of steady work, the pie pan was empty.
Take that, Lorraine,
Sans said, emptying his glass for the 3rd time.
Ain't nobody messes with us.
Papyrus sat back, glowing with victory and vision blurring slightly. At last, he said, the world is safe again.
That's right. We're unfucking-stoppable.
Sans leaned back in his chair and smoothly toppled over backwards. His momentum carried him through a graceless somersault. Papyrus stood, bracing himself against the table. Are you all right? He walked unsteadily over to Sans, who was lying on his face and giggling into the carpet.
Bro, I don't think I can read,
Sans said, voice muffled against the floor.
You wanna just watch TV?
Papyrus nodded, which made the room tip to one side. Yes, he said, once he realized Sans couldn't see the gesture. Yes, I think that would be best. So much for being productive today. Well, if Undyne had put it off for so long, another afternoon wouldn't make a great deal of difference. By an unspoken agreement, they'd both settled on the floor, using the couch as a backrest. The television cast a cool light over the room as they let the afternoon pass by. Papyrus toyed with the bottle of cider in his hand. Somewhere in the back of his mind, in a small corner that wasn't yet saturated with alcohol, lurked the thought that he'd almost certainly had too much to drink and should probably stop. After all, the quiche was gone, along with his need, however tenuous it had been, for the cider. One more swig filled that corner up nicely, and he handed the bottle back over to Sans. This went on for 1.5 episodes of cooking with a killer robot, the bottle slowly but steadily growing lighter.
I don't get it with this guy,
Sen said, slurring a little.
Doesn't even have a mouth. What's with all the cooking shows?
Papyrus shrugged. Maybe he likes making it, even though he can't eat. It's fun.
Seems kinda pointless.
Papyrus, had he been sober, might have been able to make an argument to the effect that inspiring other monsters to try cooking was the point, immaterial of whether Metaton could eat what he was making himself. But he wasn't sober, and it was too many thoughts to string together. He said, instead. They lapsed back into a comfortable silence.
So,
Sen said after a while,
I think you should stay in tonight. Take a break from that magic shit.
Lord, not this again. Why's that? Sans gave him a sidelong glare.
'Cause you're making yourself sick. Your bruises are gone, but you still look like crap.
He took a long pull from the bottle and handed it back.
Even you need rest now and then, and you won't do it.
Thanks for that. Papyrus swirled the cider in the bottle, watching it spin into a little whirlpool. He'd long passed the point of being buzzed. On the rare instances when he did drink, he was always the responsible one, always knowing the exact point to stop. Right now, he was well and truly drunk, and not having much fun being so. He took another drink, passed the bottle back to Sans.
It's true is all. What's the point of doing this to yourself, huh?
Sans didn't hesitate, draining half the bottle's remaining contents, head thrown back. He took a moment to regard the bottle, idly picking at the label. Doesn't flare up as bad if I'm tired enough, Papyrus said, which was true. That itching feeling had been gone all day, and even yesterday's incident hadn't pushed him over the edge. He'd been able to hold his magic down even through the pain. Flowey could be right or wrong about whether their new nightly practice would help him get back the control he used to have, but in the meantime, the constant exhaustion would keep him from hurting anyone. San seemed to think on this for a while, still picking away at the cider label. The cooking show wasn't very interesting anymore. Papyrus shifted, slumping so he could rest his head on the couch cushion and crossing his arms over his chest. He watched the light from the TV flicker across the ceiling. Please don't worry so much, he said. I'll get this figured out. The only reply was a grunt. For a few minutes, the only sound aside from the TV was the soft click of bone on glass and the tearing of paper. That sort of thing used to drive Papyrus up the wall. Another mess to clean up. He couldn't recall when he'd last vacuumed the living room, come to think of it. San sat up a little straighter, setting the bottle down between them.
You know, you're my whole family, yeah?
Papyrus blinked. That was an accurate statement, even if the wording was strange. They had no cousins, no uncles or aunts, no parents. All they'd ever had was each other. It had never bothered him, not really. Yeah, he said. He kept his gaze fixed on the ceiling.
And even if we weren't brothers, you'd still be my best friend,
Sans went on, the cider rendering him wordier than usual.
But we are. And it's always been just me and you, hasn't it? Right down the line.
That's true. Papyrus could feel the oncoming guilt trip and braced for impact. Sans fell quiet, as though collecting his thoughts.
And that's never gonna change, all right? There's nothing you could tell me that would ever...
He trailed off, losing either his train of thought or his nerve.
Anyway, he said, I'm always rooting for you. So don't think you ever have to go it alone, okay? Because you don't.
Self-consciousness radiated from him. Tipping over against Papyrus's shoulder, he flashed a goofy smile.
I, love you, bro.
There it was. If Papyrus had felt bad before, he felt 1,000 times worse now. He reached out to catch the cider bottle before Sans knocked it over and set it aside. Neither of them needed another drop. "I love you too," he said, sitting up and dislodging Sans. He drew his legs up to his chest and stared ahead at the TV without really seeing it. Sans's voice wasn't given to loudness, but for all it was more of a creaking groan than anything else, it was jarring.
"Stop it,"
he said, grabbing Papyrus's arm and doing his best to shake him.
Stop it!
What? Papyrus snapped, turning to glare at him since he couldn't really avoid it any longer. His annoyance evaporated at the look on Sans's face.
Why won't you talk to me?
There were 1,000 things Papyrus could say to that, and it was an effort not to blurt out the wrong one. The only safe answer was none at all. Why is every day bad? Sans broke the stare, his gaze sliding away as he heaved a sigh. Seconds became minutes, and Papyrus thought that perhaps that was the end of the matter. But at last, Sans sighed again.
Time is a flat circle.
And Sans was officially too drunk for cogent thought. Papyrus moved to stand. Maybe they needed coffee or something. Some water at least.
No,
Sans said, grabbing Papyrus by the wrist and hauling him back down.
I'm trying to be serious. You asked.
You're not making sense. Sans could be confusing even while sober, but the weird non sequiturs always got worse when he'd been drinking. Generally, it was some of his sci-fi rambling, alternate universes and string theory, and other topics that sailed over Papyrus's head. This was nothing new.
Don't worry about it,
Sans said, leaning back against the couch.
It doesn't matter.
He chuckled.
Kinda like everything I do. Get it?
He looked over at Papyrus, lopsided grin tacked on.
He said. I guess it wasn't a very good joke.
This was new. Papyrus sat up, his own concerns forgotten. What do you mean? A tight knot of worry took up residence under his ribcage. The grin slipped, too heavy to hold up.
Well now, if you're gonna make me explain the joke, it really won't be funny.
Sans gathered up a handful of label bits and tossed them into the air like sad confetti.
Nothing I do matters,
he said, as the paper floated down around them.
At all.
That's not true. Papyrus didn't know what else to say. If he tried to talk too much, he was sure he'd start crying, and that wouldn't help anything.
It is, though.
Sans tapped his fist against his chest.
I know so. Believe me, bro. I tried real hard to convince myself different.
He shrugged.
Even this doesn't matter, in the long run. Don't know why I'm still so broke up over it,
he said, and rasped out a single humorless laugh.
That's unfair, don't you think? All the bad parts still suck just as much as ever, even if it feels like the millionth time it's happened. But anything good is just... gray.
Oh, he was not going to be able to keep it together much longer. Hearing his brother talk as though he were on the edge of falling down was more than Papyrus was prepared to deal with. "How long?" he asked, past the hand he'd pressed to his mouth.
Honestly, couldn't tell you, bro,
Sans said. Palms turned upward like he was about to do a magic trick.
Kind of a meaningless question. No offense.
"What do you mean?" Papyrus repeated, getting more frantic by the second. He felt like there was a crucial detail he kept missing, some code he wasn't breaking fast enough. Sans looked older somehow. Frailer. Dry as tinder and hollow as a drum.
Nothing, he said. I just don't know when it all started. Can't remember. Feels like forever.
"You never said anything." Papyrus hadn't noticed, not in all that time. Clueless. Selfish.
Didn't see the point. Why worry when you can't fix it?
Sans grinned.
It's okay, Papyrus. I'm fine. I just kinda want to not exist. That's all. It's just one of those...
Papyrus didn't know how Sans planned to finish that sentence, and he didn't care. He dragged Sans into a hug, barring his arms around his brother as though whatever was in Sans' skull making him think these things were a physical threat he could ward off. He was dimly aware that he was crying. He didn't know what else to do.
Hey!
Sans said, muffled against Papyrus's shirt.
Don't start that! You know I'm a weepy drunk, damn it!
"I'm sorry," Papyrus sniffled. "I'm sorry." With an effort, he loosened his grip, visions of bones soft and crumbly as chalk marching through his mind. Of hopelessness, cancerous, filling up every crack. He'd always had to be careful around Sans. There were so many ways he could get hurt, so many ways he could get sick. But what could he do about this? What could he do? Wriggling an arm free, Sans patted Papyrus's back in a lame sort of comfort.
Hey,
he said again, quietly.
I'm not going to do anything to upset you, alright? I would never put you through that.
Papyrus shook his head. The thought alone was bad enough. He didn't want to hear about it. But he'd left Sans alone with this for too long already. "Why do you want to?" he asked, voice gone croaky.
It's not that I want to,
Sans said, and it was a blessing that their positioning meant they couldn't really look at each other.
It's just... I mean... It would just be easier sometimes. Like, if I could maybe sleep for the rest of my life, that'd be pretty nice.
He sighed, and seemed to shrink in on himself, smaller in Papyrus's arms.
I'm real tired, bro.
The worst part, Papyrus thought, as he tried and failed to get any words at all past the lump in his non-existent throat, was that he could understand. That particular idea hadn't crossed his mind, but Sans had been fighting a lot longer than him. How tired could a person get before they were too tired? He had the sudden, clear realization that he could never unknow this. It would eat at him and keep on eating at him. He couldn't unhear what he'd heard. And he couldn't fix it. Sans was right about that. Sans worked his other arm free and hugged him back.
Sorry, he said. This is kinda why I didn't want to tell you. But,
His fingers snagged on Papyrus's shoulder blade as he clutched at the fabric of his shirt.
If something's up, you can tell me. I'm not gonna judge you or anything like that. I'll get it.
Even without Flowey's threat hanging over him, Papyrus didn't want to put yet more weight on Sans' shoulders, making him worse off than he already was.
You can't fix it.
Sans squeezed him hard, with a muttered curse. Then he shook himself free and stood, wobbling and unsteady.
Come on,
he said, grabbing Papyrus's hand and pulling. Papyrus sat and stared up at him.
What?
He said, watching Sans haul on his arm.
Come outside,
Sans said, leaning back with all his weight trying to get Papyrus up.
Stand up and stop making me look like a dumbass.
What was outside? Papyrus tried to keep a hold of Sans as he pushed himself upright to keep his brother from falling over. Somehow, he managed, even with his own sense of balance in shambles. It was good that they lived on the edge of town. There was no one around to see them tear-stained and sloppy drunk, wandering barefoot through the snow. They walked down the road east of town, far enough that the warm breeze from Waterfall could be felt, stirring up a dense fog off of the river. Papyrus was at a loss, confusion edging out some of the misery.
What are we doing here?
Sans stopped.
There's something I need to show you,
he said, squaring his shoulders and swaying only a little.
But,
Yes?
Papyrus met his stare, mystified and a little scared. What was going on?
You have to promise you won't freak out.